Welcome, and thank you for downloading the first episode of Enlightened Despots. I'm your host, Marissa Peterson. I have always been interested in periods of transition, in defining societal pressures or changes that spark humanity to innovate. Society can change for a lot of reasons, but there is always an underlying cause driving that change. The Enlightenment Age is one such period of rapid transformation. From about 1650 to 1800, education swept across Europe and eventually into the Americas. At this time, a strong emphasis was placed on educating European royal and noble children. When these children grew up, they filled governmental positions, making changes to policies which would expand social consciousness, giving rise to questions of equality and democracy. Voltaire was one of the most prominent philosophers of the Enlightenment. He supported the idea of freedom of speech, believing everyone has the right to state their opinion on the government. He also promoted freedom of religion. John Locke, another prominent philosopher, said all humans have three natural rights: life, liberty, and property. It is up to the government to protect these rights. At this time, Europe was basically ruled by despots. A despot is a ruler who holds absolute power and typically exercises it in a cruel or oppressive way. Due to the liminality of this period, there was also another type of despot reigning in Europe, an enlightened despot. These rulers used their absolute power to pursue legal, social, and educational reforms inspired by the Enlightenment. Monarchs who earned the title enlightened despot read the works of Voltaire and Locke. They studied Diderot and other intellectuals of the day. These people were highly educated. However, when it comes to governing, improvement often gives way to pragmatism, limiting the impact of their far-reaching ideals. Catherine the Great is quoted as saying, "You philosophers are lucky men. You write on paper, and paper is patient. Unfortunate empress that I am, I write on the susceptible skins of living beings." While the term enlightened despot may sound contradictory, it only helps to highlight the contradictory rules these monarchs held. The enlightened despot would fight to the death to keep their ultimate power, but they believed it was the sole responsibility of the monarch to guide their country to prosperity and happiness. Did they succeed? Are enlightened despots near angelic figures who reign over their people with brilliance and justice? Or are they maniacal egotists with great PR people? Perhaps they are something in between. Catherine the Great, who ruled Russia from 1762 to 1769, is a perfect example of the contrasting ideas present during the reign of enlightened despot. We will be spending the majority of this episode on her rise to power. We will discuss who her influences were and how she grew from a minor German princess to one of the most important women during the 18th century. Catherine has been remembered as an enlightened leader, a vixen, a tyrant, and many other contradictory ways throughout history. These opposing character reports make it difficult to decide how to remember her, but by investigating her life and reign, I hope to prove that despite her failure to end serfdom in Russia, she does ultimately deserve the title Enlightened Despot. Catherine is quoted as saying, "I shall be an autocrat, that is my trade, and the good Lord will forgive me, for that is his." This quote exemplifies her feelings towards governing. Catherine inherited, or stole, depending on whose side you're on, a country that was known for being culturally backwards. Having more in common with her Oriental neighbors than with Europe, Russia was a hard society to rule. When Catherine arrived, the country was still in the process of westernization. Their size and status as a world power was still developing. Originally, Russia was a comparatively small country situated on an open plain. They were continually terrorized by Mongol raiders who would race across the steppes. Cities obviously were slow to develop because it basically made them sitting ducks for the nomadic Mongols, and they were easily destroyed. This was the state of affairs in Russia from the 13th to the 15th century. Plus, warlords don't care about establishing thriving economies or building a happy civilization. They only care about collecting tribute. With the raiders also came the interchange of goods, people, culture, and ideas. This created the Oriental flair Russia is still known for today. Catherine the Great was actually born in Prussia, modern-day Germany. Her birth name was Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst, a princess to a minor German principality. Oddly enough, Sophie actually means wisdom, so maybe a little foreshadowing. Growing up, little Sophie is said to have a near photographic memory and was extremely pleasant to be around. She was socially intelligent as well as intellectual. Naturally proud and headstrong, she learned to hold back those traits when necessary. These abilities made for a dynamic personality. She could be demure, or bold, or seductive, depending on what the situation called for. Catherine had 3 critical influences from her childhood: her father, her governess, and her mother. From her father, Catherine learned how to govern. Catherine's father, Christian August, Prince of Anhalt-Zerbst, was a war hero under King Frederick II. By all accounts, he was an honest, stable, pious man, devoted to his Lutheran faith. He was known for staying out of European politics, choosing instead to focus on governing his small principality. Basically, he was just a stable older guy who focused on his little world and liked to stay at home. Catherine's father was truly fond of her. He bought her books to read, employed a quality German professor to tutor her, and sought to her a religious education with lessons from their pastor. Biographers such as Robert K. Massey attribute Catherine's level-headedness and administrative abilities to her father's influence. Catherine's governess was a wonderful French woman named Babette Cardel. Babette loved Catherine and was the only one who knew how to handle the precocious child, encouraging her inquisitive nature and teaching her French. This gift of language would open Catherine up to the most cutting-edge intellectual conversations of her day, as French was the language of the educated nobility. Years later, when Catherine was empress of all the Russias, she still held Babette's teaching in high esteem, proudly signing her letters to Voltaire as the pupil of Babette Cardel. Catherine's mother, Johanna, was an entirely different story. From a higher-ranking Prussian noble family, Johanna was just 15 when she was forced to marry the 37-year-old Christian. She always believed she married beneath her, and this caused extreme resentment of her place in the world. She turned into a petty, jealous person, and I'm sure you can guess, that made for a less than ideal mother. Johanna was always cold to Catherine and would put her down in front of others. This hurt Catherine so deeply, she still recalled her mother's rejection while writing her memoirs as an empress. For all of Johanna's personal faults, she was tenacious. This trait might also seem like a bad thing, but in a world where society demands demure women, Catherine would have benefited from seeing a strong woman go after what she wanted, even if Johanna didn't do it in the most elegant of ways. When Catherine was just 14, Johanna received a letter inviting her to the court of Russian Empress Elizabeth for official business. The note added, "Oh, and bring your daughter along too." Catherine's mother and father read between the lines. They knew this was an official summons. Catherine and Johanna would go to the court of Elizabeth to meet Catherine's potential husband and heir to the throne, Peter III. Deciding at that moment to seize her opportunity, Catherine would work the next 20 years to put herself on the Russian throne. In Catherine's memoir, she writes, "Although I was still a child, the title queen felt sweetly on my ears." When I was reading Catherine's story, I couldn't see why Empress Elizabeth of Russia would choose a princess from a minor German principality as a wife for her heir to the Russian throne. This is a royal family we are talking about. Marriages were made for connections or land, some kind of profit. If Catherine wasn't bringing a large dowry or political ties, why was she chosen? At this time, Catherine's father received a promotion from Frederick the Great, King of Prussia. As a thank you, Johanna arrived at his court with a portrait of Catherine. The king loved the little painting. With this one portrait, the stars practically aligned, lighting Catherine's way to the Russian throne. This picture was sent from the King of Prussia to the Empress of Russia, with a note about Catherine's intellect and charm. Prussia was the favorite breeding ground for eligible princesses at the time. Because the land was made up of so many principalities, there were more royal families in this one area than was typically common. This created a lot of princesses to choose from. Plus, they were typically well-mannered and knew their place, because they were small potatoes. When Empress Elizabeth of Russia was looking for a bride for her nephew and heir to the Russian throne, Peter III, she, of course, turned to Prussia to find his bride. Then, lo and behold, a gift from the King of Prussia himself, a portrait of beautiful little Catherine. This was an official backing from the King of Prussia, endorsing Catherine as his choice for the bride of the heir to the Russian throne. The disparity of the Russian people did not escape Catherine's young gaze. She was appalled at the jarring sights as she left palaces of splendor, where women were literally dripping with diamonds, to the city streets where the common man was downtrodden and depressed. Joan Haslip, in her biography on Catherine, writes, 40 years later, Catherine was still vying against the Muscovites, who lived in luxury and squalor. The great ladies, blazing with diamonds, driving out of courtyards piled high with filth. Their lackeys were wearing dirty liveries, rich with gold lace. But what she resented the most was that this corrupt aristocracy, whom she despised, had been powerful enough to prevent her from carrying out her plans for reform, and from realizing her ambitions to better the conditions among the serfs. End quote. Empress Elizabeth taught Catherine about public relations. Having orchestrated her own coup to seize power, Elizabeth was a master at projecting herself in a favorable light. Catherine wrote, "No one could see Elizabeth for the first time without being overwhelmed by her beauty and majesty. She was very tall and very stout, without it being the least bit disfiguring or in any way impeding the grace of her movements." Empress Elizabeth's father was Peter the Great, the man most believed to be responsible for westernizing Russia. He is said to have dragged Russia kicking and screaming into the modern world. While her father was famous for westernizing political reforms, Empress Elizabeth chose to spread culture instead. She built many of the lavish palaces Catherine would inherit. She promoted French fashion and language. Empress Elizabeth was naturally charismatic, but chose to leave the governing to her advisors. This is the way she differs from Catherine. When Empress Elizabeth passed away, she owned 15,000 dresses. But by the time Catherine passed away, she owned 1/6 of the world. After Empress Elizabeth passed away on December 25, 1761, her chosen heir, Catherine's husband, Peter III, took the throne. He was not a popular figure in Russian society. Peter was raised in Germany, like Catherine, but unlike Catherine, he chose not to adopt the language or customs of his new land. Peter was pathetically loyal to the King Frederick of Prussia. Peter is known to have said, "I am prouder to be the Duke of Holstein than the Tsar of all the Russias." Obviously, this attitude did not endure him to the Russian people. After only 6 months on the throne, Peter III was deposed by his wife. Catherine rallied the troops, asking them to save her and her infant son from their malicious father. They readily agreed. Catherine dressed in a military commander's uniform, a political move she learned from Empress Elizabeth, and crowned herself on July 9, 1762. After 20 years of planning, studying, plotting, and surviving, she finally made it. She achieved her childhood dream of wearing the Russian crown in her own right. Not only was she Empress of Russia, but she was also sole ruler. Brimming with innovative ideas gleaned from the writings of enlightened philosophers, Catherine was eager to see what she could do. And this is where we will leave her. We will return in 2 weeks with the second half of this episode, diving into her policies, influences, and accomplishments. Thank you for listening, and until next time, до свидания.